Hey, you're listening to the Wise Words Book Club, where we don't just read, we remember. And in this case, we take the best ideas from some of the best non-fiction books and teach you how to apply them to the real world. So, without further ado, let's listen to some wise words.
So the question is, how do you read a book?
Oh gosh, if only I knew.
What were your key takeaways, mate? Like, what was the first thing that spoke to you?
It was kind of this aspect of kind of like progressive overload in terms of reading. In terms of like,
Okay,
to get better at reading, you need to read things that are beyond your ability, which
sure.
makes perfect sense. I think if you think like you're always reading the same sort of stuff that you already know, then you're not pushing yourself, and I think like a big thing that Mortimer Adler, the author, um tries to get across is that we need to start to go back to like the classics, go back to the sort of original point at where these things originated from. And because they're like hard, like realistically, there's a reason why they've stayed around for years and years, and it's
Hmm.
because they're classics, they're the greats. And the difference is that a lot of books today, you can read it, you can take the notes and then go away, but these books are so above your head that you can read them, go away, come back, and you still, despite you've grown, like you still there's still so much to take away from the book. And it's like as while you go along and you update your sort of knowledge of the world and everything, you have a different take on the book every time. And I think that's why these like old classic books are so good for you, and that we need to try and push ourselves rather than reading the same things like over and over again, or the same level of things.
Sure. I think it was interesting as well. Like, when you read one of the old sort of books, they are almost, they're the first people, they're the pioneers, and they're tackling the initial problem. If you kind of get me,
Yeah,
so you get more context of what they were trying to solve. Um. So yeah, it's like you can understand the problem from the like exactly what they're trying to solve. So the example I saw or I heard of was with like maths. We get told equations and solutions rather than actually the problems they're solving. Um, so it's like we're starting off at the very end. We're starting off with like the solution, but we don't actually know what they're like, why that solution matters, or what it's actually trying to achieve.
yeah,
And when you start at that point, you kind of lose all the understanding that you would have gained if you understood the initial problem.
yeah.
Um,
And like you need that sort of context to it. It's like, um, 1 plus 1 equals 2, but why does 1 plus 1 equal 2? You have to have, what problem are you actually trying to solve, not just like the mathematical equation to it.
yeah,
And that's why these like greats, these like writers are amazing, because you need them. Like obviously they're not going to get everything right when they write these things. Like they are
mhm,
the pioneers. They are the ones that didn't just like question a system already put in place. They invented it. They went into they ventured into the unknown. And I think that's the difference. It's like now we have a lot of stuff that is built off, I think you were saying the other day, uh like expository, like sort of information, rather than like the revolutionary information.
yeah,
And I think that is a key thing, because otherwise you're starting at like the end of the line, the end problem, rather than like knowing where all these problems originated from in the first place.
yeah, and also like the thought process that went into solving them. Um, I heard I think his interesting point was like one of the best ways to learn science was. I mean, I guess you kind of did this at school because you kind of did experiments, right? But the best way to learn is to actually undertake the experiments that they were doing.
Yeah,
But then it becomes a level of actually understanding why you're doing those experiments. You never got really taught in chemistry why the hell you're pouring this acid into this alkaline. Like why should I care, kind of thing. Um, what's the application in the real world, right? I think that's where a lot of people struggle. Um, I think it's interesting as well. He had a point about that the best way to learn is also through discovery rather than instruction. I
mm,
don't know if you picked up on that.
yeah,
Um, so like I guess this goes back down to like the open loop things, like in terms of curiosity, right? So your brain, if you get just given an answer, your loop is already closed. You've never asked a question, it's just that information stored. But if you ask a good question, or you're curious about why something exists, right, you then open up uh, a loop in your brain, which then, using like sort of either reading or doing research, etc., you try and figure out the way to close that loop.
Yeah.
And that's the only way in my head that you can actually effectively learn,
Yeah.
because then you're motivated to close that loop yourself. And otherwise, if people just give you the answer, it's easy. It's a bit like Google, right? You can Google anything you want and you're going to get an answer in 10 seconds. But that doesn't give you like sustained curiosity and true understanding.
Yeah.
You just kind of learn, like, as you say, like with the rotes, you just learn rotes. So you just learn the fact, but you don't actually learn what came before the fact.
Yeah. You're learning the information, but not the understanding behind it.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense at all when, like, you consider that, okay, so you're in, I don't know, year 10, and then you learn the information in that year, but you don't understand it, and then you go a year later, you get even harder information, yet you still don't understand the basics. So it's like you're just piling on all this information, trying to understand it, but you don't, like,
Yeah.
you're not taught that. The reason why you're not taught that is because you're not taught how to self-teach. And that is the actually, like, one of the main things I got from this book is this self-teaching aspect. The fact that a teacher is should only help you as an aid you, but they shouldn't tell you how to connect the dots. They should
Yes.
tell
Yeah.
you that the other dot exists and you have to connect it, because realistically, you have a completely different setup in your mind than anyone else. So no one else can know how you're going to connect that, what hook you're going to connect that to, and so you need to do it yourself. And I think being able to contextualize information so that you yourself can understand it is crucial in self teaching.
Yeah. I think an interesting like analogy or metaphor I heard for the idea of just applying information rather than understanding is like, the story of the Trojan Horse, where the Greeks
Yeah,
um, went into Troy with a horse and obviously had the men hidden in the horse, and obviously took them all by surprise and took over the city.
yeah,
Um, like basically what happens is, if you're learning information, you are then just learning that, like the concept of just doing that. So basically, if you learn just information, you then think a good idea is to do it again. You think, right, okay, cool, right, let's get a Trojan horse and let's go in. But you're forgetting the underlying principle. The underlying principle of that whole situation was it was surprising. They would never have guessed that there are people hidden there, and that's what surface level information is. You kind of learn it and you think, right, that okay, that meant that, therefore I could do it again. Where in reality, you're not understanding the mechanism behind why it was effective. Um,
well, it's novel, isn't it? It's like, it's novel. It's not. That's what the surprise is that it's not familiar. If they had done 100 Trojan horses, I think, they would see it coming.
the principle, essentially, the principle behind it was, nobody had ever done it before. They thought it was a gift, um, and they thought it was almost like a peace offering, right? So they'd been completely tricked. Doing that again after people have become familiar with what it is wouldn't work,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the point. Um, yeah,
And I think if you apply that aspect to learning,
yeah,
and trying to instill sort of novel information so that your mind is like piqued, your mind is interested in it, because your mind has to process all this sort of new information so that it can categorize it and say, oh, whether it's a threat or not, or whether it's going to help us in the future or not. So
yeah.
I think when you apply that to self-teaching, I think that is crucial, because the reason why how to read a book is trying to get that across is that books are absent teachers. You don't have anyone to question when you're reading it. You only have yourself. And I think when your brain is put into a position where it has to try and figure something out, I think those are the crucial bits where you really grow, because you have to adapt. Your brain, you are literally adapting to the knowledge you're taking in.
Well, you have to connect the dots.
Yeah.
Your brain's an association machine, and it
Yeah.
works connectively. So,
And it makes
yeah,
sense in terms of what you were saying in with the you're posing the gaps, like you're creating the gaps in your knowledge.
yeah. So there's an interesting bit. You're obviously reading the molecule more at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah.
Where it kind of, I don't know if I think it does talk about it, or James Clear at least talks about it. It's the reward prediction error. So it's like your brain predicts something. So you've got this information coming in, you're seeing something, or this material, this teaching material for the first time, and you guess kind of what it means. If a teacher or somebody in a book can give you an example where you predict the answer and then the answer's not what you predicted, you then spark up and pay attention, if you
Mm,
kind of get,
yeah,
which I think really like the whole idea back to this novelty thing is, if you can present information which makes people go, actually, wait a second, like I got that wrong. I thought it was going to be this,
yeah.
but actually it means this, or this worked, and then you get curious because you're like, why did that work?
Well,
Why was I wrong?
a
Um,
perfect example I've seen of this is magicians.
mhm.
Okay, because they end up creating this mental model for you. Okay, you're
Yeah.
watching them and they're creating this whole thing, and then it's like, oh, okay, it's in the left hand, it's in the left hand, and they're creating that mental model. But what they're doing is they're purposely creating a wrong mental model.
Yes.
That you're creating these sort of predictions, and then what happens is, when they show you the trick, it's like, oh wow, your predictions have been challenged, and then your brain suddenly like shoots into attention and goes, oh wait a minute, maybe I should pay attention, and I
Yeah.
think if you can apply this sort of challenging predictions, you can apply it to so many things. I was like humor, the same with like comedians,
Yeah.
things like that. That's what humor is. It's like, oh, people think it's going to be this, and then suddenly the last bit is changed, and
Well, evolutionary makes sense. Your brain rewards these prediction errors because basically, if something happened in the past and you predicted it wrong, your brain then wants you to pay attention to be like, right, you need to figure this out, because if you face this same like sort of context again and you get it wrong again, this could be the difference between life and death. I mean, obviously, it's not to that extent, but the whole point is your brain is wired to try and figure stuff out, or to is its reward system rewards you figuring something out, or
yeah,
at least closing a gap, or if you predicted something wrong, it then needs to know why. um but yeah, the principles behind that are really interesting. I think it's really important for education and everything.
yeah,
And I find also the best books and stuff I read, or the ones that have the biggest impact, are the ones that definitely induce this prediction error, or sort of they tell me a story where I think I'll know the answer, and then they sort of flip it on its head.
yeah. No, exactly. It's kind of like questioning something that you haven't come across yet.
Yeah. Or like giving you an alternative, something you didn't consider.
Yeah,
You get me? Um, one of my favorite examples is like, I've read quite a lot around copywriting. Copywriting is like the art of getting somebody to buy and purchase something. And one of the best ways they ever get curiosity is they take like a common conception that we all have as society, like a common thing, like, oh, you have to have a job, you have to get married, and they spin it on its head and they ask the question like, do you? And then they try and make their point. And the whole point of that is it makes you question your original belief, kind of thing, and then it sort of debunks it. And like, there's no doubt there's no objective truth in that, but the idea of taking something that you think you know and then spinning on its head, it
yeah,
gets your attention,
yeah.
because you're so used to predicting that that's the correct way. So when they break it, you're like, oh crap, why is that?
Well, that's exactly it. It's like whether it's the right way or not. Like you said, there's no certainty in it, but it's another answer that you could substitute into that gap, you know
Yeah,
and it's like, oh, will this make it work better for me or not? Because that's all you're doing, is you're taking this novel information and you're substituting it in as an answer and seeing
yeah,
how it works as like a mental model, and depending
sure.
on how well it works depends on what answer you pick,
Yeah.
and that's why, like, the more answers you acquire, the more range of options you have.
Do you know what, it's not even just answers, is it, man? I think it's more like the more perspectives you can consider.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, I do. I completely agree with that. I think the more ways you can look at something, the better. I think I was saying to you the other day about the scientific revolution, and like how the physicians, like people who study physics, and then chemists, basically have different definitions of like what an atom is,
mm,
and that's based on their prior learning and experience, but they're describing the same thing. And I really like this idea of like perspective is kind of like a lens. You put your lenses on depending how you want to look at something. So I could literally go into a social situation and put on a psychology lens and think, what is this guy like? Why is he behaving
yeah,
that way?
yeah,
Then you could put on like a behavioral economics lens, and be like, what's the context? Like what's overarching in his life? Like why is he behaving this way? That sort of thing. And you come up with different explanations depending which lens you've got on. Or you could be looking at it through evolutionary biology, like, oh, that he's obviously looking for status here, or something similar to that, if you get
yeah,
me.
yeah,
It all really depends how you look at it. And the problem we have is we have too many experts who are narrowing down into very specific things, and you can only see it in one way. When in reality, life is so multifaceted and there's so many different variables. It's not actually one or the other. It's actually just a combination.
yeah,
And your inability to pick up the fact that there's no one true cause and that there's obviously a load of variables is kind of like dumbfounding to most people, because we believe life is just like black and white, or we get told to believe it is because there's answers apparently.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it, and it's nothing is ever certain. Nothing is, you know, it's you can't be looking at things as if there's one answer.
Yeah,
You have to be able to question a lot of systems and update them because we're constantly like evolving and we need to be able to adapt, and to put a static rule on something that's forever changing doesn't make any sense because
for sure.
it's inevitable that it's going to um
I
backfire.
like the idea that change is the only constant.
Yeah,
That I,
yeah,
so there's no such thing as really like consistent laws because everything's ever changing. I mean, the sun's like just a big nuclear reaction, and it's consistently changing. It's never the same.
yeah,
Um, so and it's almost chaotic and random, and that's kind of what scares us the most because we're so um, we crave this idea that we can bring order to things, we can find meaning in things because that's how we've been wired. But in reality, that if you really want to go to the nihilistic perspective as well, this is another lens, I guess. It's that nothing, everything's random, and nothing really matters apart from the meaning you kind of give it.
yeah,
So you actually have that power, and that's kind of like a revolutionary idea for most people that they can actually choose their meaning.
yeah.
Most
I
people
think
don't get it.
I think this idea of order comes from things being at ease and like
Mhm.
having familiarity with things. And like I came across this a lot in the book in terms of how you approach reading a book, and what like the first aspect is like inspectional reading, and that entails skimming and a superficial read. So the skimming, of course, is basically you're going through and you're looking at certain areas. And what the idea is to prime yourself. Now, like priming is so that if I see the word book, then it's much easier to go into my brain whenever I see it anywhere else. So if you're skimming a whole book in certain like the contents, and you're preparing yourself to read, that's what it is at the core of it. It's like preparing yourself to read so that it's easiest to read when you're actually reading the whole book. And then the
Sure.
superficial read is reading it all the way through and not stopping at any of the things that like pique your interest, because that's going to slow you down. If you focus on all
Sure.
the little points, then you can't put together all the like the overarching point. So
Yeah.
I think this idea of making things familiar, priming like through reading a book is a great
Mm.
way to approach it, because a lot of books, especially if you're reading nonfiction, they can be very dense. And so,
Yeah.
your brain stopping every 10 words to try and take in like a really hard concept is going to
Yeah.
slow you down, and you're going to become overwhelmed. I think the idea is to either do like a superficial read through it straight away quickly once, and then you can go back. And the thing is, when you do
Yeah.
that, you've come across all the bits that you know was like a
The main idea sort of thing,
takeaway.
right?
Yeah, well, you've got the main ideas, but then you also like through the first read, you come across areas that you struggle with the most, and so you
Yeah.
know where those areas are when you go back and read it again in depth.
Okay.
Uh,
So what you're suggesting is you read through the first time really quick. You get like a rough skeletal structure of the whole book, right? The sort of main point, the main ideas, how he structured it, how he structured the thinking, and you kind of skim through it to try and understand the gist, right? And then you skim over the. I remember him saying something like you skim over the hard parts because that, like you just said, it slows you down.
yeah,
So if you don't understand something, you kind of just move on this first time. And then you sort of let that idea of like familiarity settle in over time. So when you go back the second time and do it slower, you've got more chance of understanding it because you've got the bigger context or the big idea from the book. So
yeah.
then you can start to understand the nuance. Um,
If you apply this to Barbara Oakland's book, A Mind for Numbers, and she talks about the diffuse mode being in place. So you've got the focus mode where you're trying to figure something out, and then when you like stop trying to figure it out, it's still going on in the back of your brain. And I think that applies to the sort of superficial read, because when you do come across those points that are quite tricky, when you go on, your brain is still kind of trying to conceptualize them a bit, trying to understand it, so that the second time when you come through and you actually pay a bit more attention to it and read it analytically, I think you're at a much better place to handle it.
yeah, I'm no neurobiologist, but I would assume it's something to do with like your brain is still trying to find these connections in the diffuse mode. You're like, even though you're not thinking about it, your brain is still trying to make sense of it to a degree, trying to fit it into to where it should be placed. If you kind of get me.
Yeah,
Um, so I think that's kind of what happens, right? It's that sort of mechanism, I would assume. But yeah, I do like the idea of like trying to understand the big ideas before you sort of delve into the sort of details, sort of thing. Like understand what problem they're trying to solve. This is back to like what we said at the beginning. It's you try and understand where the author's coming from first and what he's trying to like the point he's trying to make and why he's making it
Mm.
before then going into like the details.
Yeah, yeah. I've actually got a little like section of his that he uses as an analogy, which I think is great.
Yeah,
He says, the reader tries to uncover the skeleton that the book conceals. The author starts with the skeleton and tries to cover it up. His aim is to conceal the skeleton artistically, or, in other words, to put flesh on the bare bones. If he is a good writer, he does not bury a puny skeleton under a mass of fat. On the other hand, neither should the flesh be too thin, so that the bones show through. If the flesh is thick enough, and if flabbiness is avoided, the joints will be detectable and the motion of the parts will reveal the articulation. And I think that sums it up so well in terms of like a good writer, but also like what you're trying to find at the same time while you're
sure.
reading
Yeah, man. To be fair, he is he's a very good communicator. Actually, I really like the idea of. He almost sparked in me this idea of like metaphors and analogies to communicate
it. Mm,
information. And obviously, like we said before, the brain's a connection machine. So how can you make some? How can you make a brain which isn't familiar with something connect to something that's unfamiliar?
yeah.
So the way you do that is you use analogies and metaphors to convey a familiar concept. For example, I don't know, like you could talk about a rocket ship taking off, and that way, some everybody can understand and conceptualize what that is. And if you can explain a concept through something like that, people can get hold of it quicker.
Mm,
And I think he was the guy as well who introduced me to the origins of the word communication, and that it's all around to is the root of the word communication is obviously common, and it talks about making something common. So you can only communicate effectively when you make something common between the two people, right? So I think it's interesting that we go through life and we think we're really communicating with people, but if we're talking in abstract language or stuff they can't quite understand, you literally are not communicating in terms of the actual definition of what it is.
yeah. Well, you said common equals familiar, doesn't it? Like everyone is, and so it's like once you can explain something in a familiar term to someone else.
Yeah, that's what they say. The mark of a genius is to explain something in its simplest terms, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Or yeah, like what was the thing? You don't know something well enough until you can explain it to a 6-year-old. I'm
Yeah,
probably paraphrasing Einstein.
it's something like that. But yeah, no, it is. I think it was Feynman or something.
Yeah.
But it makes so much sense. Like the best teachers are obviously the ones who can basically get you to get anybody to conceptualize it almost or explain something so simply that it's like the main idea is easy to grasp. Obviously, there is like as you delve deep into these ideas, there tends to be like nuances and differences in it. But just to get to grasp the overall like concept is best to do it simply.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like I found that with the author of this book. Basically like his ability of like it's kind of like meta explaining because he explains how to explain. It's really strange. Um, it's very like uh, it's very strange. Like it's very easy to read, as in like you understand what he's saying because when he says something that might be hard to might be hard to understand, he then explains how he's understand like how you should understand it, like while you're reading. So it's very like he'll say something that might be a bit of a stretch to comprehend because he's got a very good use of like the English language, and some of the things you're like, oh god, I'm a bit out of my depth here, but then he'll
yeah,
explain it as if like like we just said, in the most simplest terms. And I think especially with a book like this, you need that because it's quite dense. There's no lie about that, and it's weird that you're coming across something that you've never really been taught before. Like he goes into depth of how to approach non-fiction and practical books
yeah,
and poetry and like I've never once come across that at school where they teach you different ways to approach something, which makes perfect sense. It's like you're not approaching the same exact thing every single time. There's an array of different subjects, so it makes sense to have a different rule or a different way of approaching it.
yeah. I think there's a quote from Francis Bacon in the book which says some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested.
Yeah,
But I think that kind of brings up this interesting point that like we kind of treat all reading and stuff as the same, when in reality we shouldn't, because there's different arguments to be made. Like science makes arguments on objective truth, right? And then philosophy is more considering the possibilities or questions of life. And you don't really process these in the same sort of way.
Yeah.
Um, but yet we're kind of taught that it's all the same, right? Um, Whereas, yeah, he makes a big sort of case for why we should treat different styles of writing, different categories differently, and it makes sense. You wouldn't treat different people exactly the same way.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
doesn't make sense.
You have to
So
adapt to it, and that's that idea of, like, adapting to, something, that a system that is completely different. And a way he talks about that is the reading speed, in which, not everything is supposed to be read at the same exact speed. Like, think about how much realistically a book is someone's core ideas and then extrapolated on, and
yeah,
then put context on, and so it's like a lot of it is going to be fluff. You're not going to have a point every 3 words. So that area is, you can speed through that, but the other areas that you need to pay more attention to, you should slow down, and it has to be this adaptability in speed reading, uh,
yeah.
and not just, tackle everything in the same gung-ho sort of way.
Yeah. What in regards to what you read, would you say there's any sort of like practical reading advice? Like, what, apart from obviously what we just discussed a minute ago about the sort of skim reading first, understanding the structure, understanding the big idea, and then going back and reading more deeply if it's worth reading, right? I mean, that's almost like a taste. Is this book worth it? That's why you almost skim read in the first place. But what other sort of practical actions would you say that you got from how to read?
Well, like, he does go into actual practical books and the difference, but the actual practicalities of it, I think it's priming yourself with these questions to ask.
Sure.
You don't, if you have a reason for why you're going to a book, all the better, really. You have to have, like, you want to know what you're going to look for, what you're trying to find. That doesn't mean that, you should avoid everything else that has nothing to do with it, like, confirmation bias or anything. But if you have these sort of questions that are prompting you, then you're actively reading, and that's an aspect that he talks about, in terms of, like, the best reading is active reading. Okay,
Yeah.
the same is with listening. Okay, you can listen to someone, but you haven't really taken it in, or you haven't, like, understood it. But actively listening is completely different. It's, your whole energy, like, all of your energy is applied to the other person, trying to understand them. The same is with the book. You have this kind of relationship between the author and the reader, okay, as if he is talking to you, and you have to
Yeah.
actively listen. But in this case, it's reading, and you have to actively read. And a way to do that is to, perk yourself up by having these sort of four main questions, in which to have at the back of your mind when you're reading. And, like, so the four are, like, what's this book about as a whole? What's this book about in detail? Is this book true? Like, can you critique it? And what if it is? How can you use it? And so I think those are the steps in which you can, take this sort of raw information, get the ideas, mix it with the context, critique it, and then apply it. So you're taking raw information and then making it your own. And how do you, use that step process into applying this actual information that you've acquired? Because everyone can read a book, but what's the point if you can't do anything with the information or understanding of it?
Sure. Yeah. No, it's all about like reading for understanding rather than information, right?
Hmm.
Um, I'm just trying to look here at sort of the other sort of main things. What other sort of key points do you think that you got out of it?
Well, I quite liked uh his, like, the duality or the dichotomy between, like, non-fiction and fiction, in terms of it, what you want in a non-fiction book is it for it to be very unambiguous. Okay, you don't want the meaning to be very vague and very general, in which, anyone can take their own sort of approach, because realistically you're kind of reading for facts, or yeah, kind of factual information. So you don't want to, like, have, if it's a communication between the author and the reader, you want them to be on the same page. They don't want to be, like, writing something and then you misinterpreting it and then taking it somewhere else, and, like, so I think this is where, like, he talks about a lot of terms. and where like a word in the right place and the right meaning is a term.
Mhm.
Okay, and those applied because realistically, like language changes over time, you know,
Mhm.
and the meanings of words change over time. But if you especially non-fiction books, um, if you really define a word that you're using, because words change depending on what context they're in, depending on,
Yeah.
you know, whether you're talking about, I think we had this chat the other day, whether you talk about helium in terms of physics or in terms of chemistry or biology,
Yeah.
it's all got a different kind of meaning. And so
Yeah.
you can really define that in the terms of the book that you're reading, like they're writing, then I think that's really crucial. Where it's the complete opposite with fiction, because fiction plays on your imagination, and
Yeah.
so the meaning doesn't have to be as precise. In fact, it's kind of the opposite, where you want it almost very vague so that you can interpret it however you want. You're creating the world, you're creating the fantasy. And I thought it was quite interesting, the like sort of relationship between almost being the exact opposite to an extent.
Sure.
How would you have approached a book before?
Okay, that's quite an interesting question. I guess honestly, I quite like the idea of teasing out the main. So I would have skimmed originally, like, but I probably wouldn't have gone back. What I tend to do is I try to sort of rush my reading in a sense that I've got so many books like yourself that you have to read. So I'm just trying to figure out what's the main point.
Mm,
I try and get there as quickly as possible, almost. Um, I like to say I habitually kind of try to get to the understanding. Like I always try to understand why they're saying this, or what is the main point and why is it important. I've definitely got better over time with that. But yeah, I think my main takeaway from this book, and something I do now all the time, is before even starting, I will look at the chapters, like you said, work out sort of an overall structure and what the point is of the book. I might even try and find like a summary or a synopsis online beforehand,
mm,
um, to try and understand what is the point of the book. If you get me, I mean,
yeah,
most good books tend to have what like the sort of the argument on the back or on the front, or it's almost self-explanatory. Um, but yeah, I think that I'm definitely more systematic in the way I do things now. And I try to, but obviously nobody's ever perfect with the sort of questions he gives you about answering what the book's about and why the author's sort of asking or sort of talking about this in the first place.
yeah.
Um, so now I'm kind of, yeah, I'm more systematic in the sense that I will read something and I'll think, why is he saying this, or like, um, what's the importance of this, and I try and do it, what's it, consciously almost, rather than subconsciously. So it's brought to my attention stuff which I would never thought about, basically.
It's what you were saying with like the maths, as in like, you know, understanding the actual problem of what they're trying to solve. The same as book. You're trying to understand what the author is really trying to convey, what they're trying to solve, what the problem is in the first place. You know,
So this is about practical books. He's like, in practical books, what you're trying to find out is what the author wants you to do, and then find out how he proposes you to do it.
mm,
So with like practical books, is like, what's the author trying to get you to do? Is he trying to get you to be more confident with your public speaking? Is he trying to do this? And then the secondary question is like finding out how he wants you to do that. So if it's a book on like how to win friends and influence people, so like what he wants you to make more friends or influence people, right? And then the second question is how is he trying to propose you to do that? So I think that's quite interesting. That yeah, the author's kind of, whenever you're reading a book, they're kind of not even just proposing ideas, but proposing methods as well, specifically for practical books.
yeah, no, especially. And he makes that difference actually, like the difference between theoretical and practical.
I remember him talking about scientific books as well, and he tries to sort of tease out the basic assumptions people are making.
Mm,
Um, yeah, quite like this other quote from Francis Bacon. He seems to like Francis Bacon. um, so read not to contradict and confute, nor to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse, but to weigh and consider. So the whole point of reading, he claims, is to weigh up the information that you've been given and consider it truth, which I quite like. Um,
so yeah, no, I think I kept seeing that in terms of there's kind of like this relationship between like narrowing and like comparing. So it's like
yeah,
the author what is trying to sort of narrow it down, like the meaning, like we are talking in terms of what terms, and like a meaning being unambiguous and things like that. Um, and then the reader needs to try and compare all these different things and try to find out which is like the best option, because you
Yeah,
can't know which is the best option without comparing, it
sure.
to others. And that came up quite a bit in the book.
This is another really interesting point I've just realized from my notes. So it talked about the difference between a demanding and an undemanding reader. So like he says, there's all the difference between a demanding and undemanding reader. So the latter asks no questions, so he gets no answers.
mm,
If you're an undemanding reader, if you're reading maybe just to sort of, I don't know, almost like for entertainment rather than for understanding, you will ask no questions and you'll get no answers. You're passively going through the information, whereas the demanding reader is going to be actively going through the information, trying to understand it, asking questions. And I think another thing that I haven't done, but I know you're trying to do, is you write systematically like the questions that you think the author's sort of trying to answer, or any questions. So like you see an idea in a book now, and you'll be like, right, I have a question about that. Like, what does that mean in this context or something?
mm,
Um, and opening these questions as you go along, going back to what we said at the beginning, like the only way you can really learn is by opening up these loops and trying to close them yourself.
yeah,
Because the opening of a loop in itself actually motivates you to close it.
yeah,
Whereas if you close it prematurely, like you Google something, you're like, oh, that's the answer, that's it, that's done, and you don't try and keep it open and consider multiple options, then
yeah.
you're inhibiting your growth.
You need to keep it a bit loose, so
Yeah,
that, like if you do come across another option, you can see it as a possible substitute rather than
yeah.
just like, oh no, I know that's wrong. you know
You got to have some slack in the system, mate. You can't be brittle, right? It's
yeah,
that's kind of how I.
yeah. And I think what's great about reading is that, like, you could be reading a book and it poses a question, and the book may not answer the question, but what's weird is that that question might be answered by a completely different book. Exactly. And I think that's what's fascinating, because you're able to suddenly link it somewhere that you just didn't even see, you didn't even like contemplate. And I think it's quite hard to keep all these questions in your head, so I love to like note down questions that I come across in the book, so that if they come across, and I will like tag them on my Rome research, like unanswered questions, so that I can go through them at some point and be like, okay, I've updated my knowledge, or I've read a couple books since then, and then I look at this question, I'm like, oh wow, that actually relates to this area.
Yeah, yeah.
um and yeah, you're constantly making these little connections.
I
And
think I'm gonna do copy you as well. Call it open loops on Rome, and just code like build up a whole database of things I don't really know the answer to, and just it makes a lot of sense.
I think that it's so important. It's very easy not to, and look, or to basically forget. Like, you think about how many times you've had an amazing like question, you know, and um, and then not to be able to like answer it. And I think he talks about this in terms of philosophical books and how to approach it. And he talks about how when you're a child, you have these questions that are so wacky, because they're not built of any like previous existing knowledge. It's purely creative, and these questions tend to be the most hard to answer.
Yeah,
It's and all the philosophical questions are kind of easy to question, but then incredibly hard to answer, because there's no, well, yes, but philosophy is like, you're never going to have like a certain sort of answer. But it's they say that when you're a child, you have this, and then you kind of you get conditioned out of it.
yeah,
Through school and work and college and everything like that. What happens is you end up start to question for information rather than understanding. When you're with like I've got a little nephew, and when he's about 6, and they say why, and they keep, and you can see their train of thought, and they're just trying to connect the chain to another,
mhm,
and that is it. They're trying to they're questioning for understanding. They're not questioning for spreadsheet information and things like that, that realistically doesn't make a difference and doesn't increase your understanding of something. you know um and so I think what we need to be able to do is have that ability of our previous existing knowledge, and being an adult, but then also being able to question things that are outside the norm, and question understanding.
no, 100%. I think that the questioning is an absolute skill and something we never do enough of. And I think you're right with the conditioning, mate. It's like if you look at what the whole schooling system does, is it kind of gives you this false sense that there's always an answer. Like you don't do an exam and go, oh, by the way, this question still hasn't been answered. It's always like, this is the answer. You're right. This is wrong. I mean, I get with like sort of like stuff like maths, that's kind of true. But with a lot of things, it's kind of open to debate and discussion. But what happens is we're kind of crushed. I almost see it as like a massive propaganda machine, like the whole schooling education system, in a way that it restricts creativity and sort of.
Mm.
I guess the problem is they call curiosity. What's it called? Divergent. I can't remember. Basically, no. Sorry, that's it. Deviant. Curiosity is actually essentially deviant because you are going against the established. So therefore, if you had everybody in society questioning, you would never get anything done because everybody would just running around going, "Oh, you could do that differently. You could do that." So there needs to be some level of order. But what happens is it's just crushing it out of like the majority of people, and then you get a bunch of almost like I call people who don't really question zombies because they literally don't have any other idea or questions that haven't or can't be answered to them. Um, but yeah, I think I kind of want to sort of wrap this whole thing up now in my head. Just like what if I was going to sort of summarize this whole entire book as well? Um, what would you sort of how would you go about sort of summarizing like the key points to take away?
I think the main thing to take away is you have to read actively, and to read
Hmm.
actively, you have to have like priming questions.
Hmm.
Things that you're trying to find out. It's different in like fiction, but I would say you want to be able to like stay engaged with the material, and the thing that keeps you like engaged are these questions. Is this ability to be like, oh, how does this relate to me? And if you're reading something and you're asking that question, there's no way that you can not be tuned in. You have like you will naturally be active.
No, 100%. Is there apart from that, which is, I mean, I guess that's the principle behind sort of how to read a book. You need to be active. It needs to be almost challenging, like you said at the very beginning, sort of slightly above maybe your intellectual level, or something which definitely, basically, something you can't just read and sort of like um, I want to use the word passive, but sort of more like for entertainment. Like you can sit there and you can read it in like a day or two and not really have to grasp the material. You kind of just, you skim through it all and you understand everything. I feel like that's not a good way to read. You kind of really need to tussle with like the big ideas,
Mm,
which obviously a core component of active of reading. But I guess then the other thing was we've said this multiple times now is the idea of trying to understand the structure,
yeah,
trying to almost skim read it first to get the big ideas and what it all means and why it's important to know. Um,
yeah. The structure and context, both of those.
yeah, and then I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, obviously we've gone into some smaller sort of nuanced details, um, but in terms of actual actionable things, I guess the actions I would get people to take would be to before they read. Look at all the contents, like the table of contents. Look at what each chapter's called. Try and figure out what each chapter would be about from the title. Some books are better than others for that.
Hmm.
Um, then I would obviously suggest. I think his suggestion was you go through each chapter and read like maybe 2 or 3 pages in each one, just to get the gist.
Yep.
Um, before you then come back and then read the whole thing through. I
Yep.
think one of his points as well was with this skim read, you can actually work out if it's a book worth reading, which I think is actually important because if it's not, then just move on.
Yep.
Um,
Once you read through it, for the actual context, and you've
yeah,
got that overarching idea already, it's much easier to be able to put that context and see how it relates.
yeah.
If you didn't have the overarching like point to start
Hmm.
with, it's a bit hard to kind of relate
Yeah,
it.
you've got nothing to hang the information
Yeah.
on, right? You don't really know what problem it's solving and what's the idea. Like, if you kind of like there's a book, or let's just say I read the one recently, Folly of Fools and Self Deception. If I didn't know it was on self deception, I mean, obviously it's pretty obvious when it says the logic of self deception on the front cover.
Yeah.
But if you didn't know that, you would never have any sort of concepts to originally hang it on.
Yeah.
So it's just important to understand what it's all about.
Yeah.
And so I think that was like really that's the main thesis of the book.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, guys. If you'd like to check out our book summary, head on over to our website, wisewords.blog. And if you feel like being inspired throughout the week with some little nuggets of wisdom, go and follow us on Instagram at wisewordssummons. Until next time, guys, have a good one.